Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. Before I introduce our next episode of the Authority File, I want to remind our listeners that we have a brand new podcast on the way. It's called Patron Driven, and it's a narrative-style podcast that brings you crowdsourced library stories where the personal meets the professional. Season 1 is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey, and the 2 years it took to rebuild. It's a really incredible story and features writing and producing from the whole podcast team here at Choice, including Mark Dirks, Sabrina Kofer, and myself. I hope you'll tune in. Patron Driven debuts in late June wherever you get your podcasts. You can visit our website, choice360.org, and click on the librarianship drop-down to sign up for email updates about Patron Driven. While you're there, you'll find behind-the-scenes bonus content for the new program, and you can check out the new trailer for the upcoming series. Okay, so in the meantime, in the next 4 episodes of this podcast, we're going to be talking about a new book published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. It's called The Black Prairie Archives, and it's a remarkable volume that collects a variety of works from a wide range of individuals, from 19th century black fur traders to contemporary writers and rappers. The volume sets out to redefine and expand the regional literature of the Canadian Prairie, highlighting the cultural output of late 19th and early 20th century black writers and residents of the Prairie, while finding a through line to today's black writers living in the same areas. The book is ambitious in its goal of transforming the traditional literary perspective of the Prairie, male, anglophone, and white, to one that is culturally more accurate. My guest is Karina Vernon, the editor of the Black Prairie Archives and an associate professor of English at the University of Toronto, where she focuses on teaching and research on Black Canadian literature, archives, and decolonization. This series is brought to you by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this first episode, Karina helps us understand what the Canadian Prairie is, how it has been traditionally perceived and written about, and how her book came together. All right, so Karina, welcome to the program.
It's good to be with you, Bill.
All right. So let's start. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the story is that the Prairie most often tells about itself, or that is told about in the prevailing Canadian culture.
It's a great question. When I ask my students, I teach at the University of Toronto at the Scarborough campus, which is a suburb of Toronto. When I ask them, how do they imagine the Canadian prairies? And many of them have not been out west, so they're going by, the stories they hear of the prairies, what they've read of the prairies, the cultural representation of the prairies. What comes to their mind primarily is land. And the dominant story told of the prairies centers on its landscape, and it fetishizes that landscape. What we think of the prairies really is a varied landscape. It's forest and hills and the northern part and southern part, and it's very varied. But what comes to represent the prairies in its culture is the flat, untreed, high prairie grassland that comes to star, so to speak, in the dominant story of the prairies.
Okay.
And the literary regionalists of the 1970s and 80s argued that geography, that particular geography, is what not only shaped but came to determine Prairie people's character and their culture. And so the authentic Prairie person that emerged from that literary criticism was usually male, usually anglophone, and white. So that's come to be the dominant story of the prairies. It's thought of as a landlocked, bounded space. That's come to be equivalent or identical with the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And so the story of its others, its Black presence, its Indigenous presence, for hundreds of years, that has been sort of a repressed aspect of the Prairie story.
Right. So this is a great moment to segue into your book, and I'm wondering if you could just describe the project of the Black Prairie Archive. And I think there's, in our previous conversations, there's a really interesting story you have in how it kind of you got started with it. So it would be great if you could talk a little bit about that as well as,
Oh,
you know,
certainly.
yeah.
It started, this project, I guess, like a lot of archival projects, this one started with an accidental discovery in the archives. I
Right.
was a graduate student at the University of Victoria. I mean, I had grown up on the prairies, never imagining that it had a significant Black population or a significant Black history. So when I began my PhD at the University of Victoria, I set out to study African American literature.
Mm-hmm.
I had been aware of some contemporary Black writing from the prairies, but I never imagined that there was a historical or archival literature. So I was just wandering among the shelves of the university library, and I came across a shelf of books about the region where I had grown up in Alberta. And I was drawn to these books. I mean, I left Alberta determined never to go back, but somehow on
Right.
this day, I was drawn to this shelf of books, and I opened up one of the books, and it was a travel log by William Francis Butler, who had traveled through the territories now regionalized as the Prairie. And he describes seeing one day a Black paddler sailing down the North Saskatchewan River. What struck me about about Francis Butler's writing is that he registers no surprise about seeing this Black paddler sailing down this river. And I mean, I was stunned. I thought, really, in the 1870s, there was at least this one person who was there. And not only there, Francis Butler includes a letter that this Black paddler wrote. And it kind of struck me all at once that, okay, there were Black people in this space, and how many more of them were there, and how many of them wrote. So that's
Mm-hmm.
what catalyzed the whole research journey. And as I say in the introduction to the book, it changed my research trajectory, but ultimately it really changed my life and my own conception of myself, my history, and my place on the prairies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think as we get further into this conversation, I think those changes are that you mention are pretty profound in a number of different ways. And it just seems like the process of editing this volume is both different from other volumes and the same in some ways. For example, other editors we've talked to have solicited contributions. Obviously, you couldn't necessarily do that for this entire volume, or at the very least, not in every instance. Um, there's also a certain inclusivity to the volume. You've worked to bring in diverse voices, time periods, types of writing. Like any editor, you've had to hunt down pieces for inclusion. In ways, constructing any volume is a journey. Can you tell us about as you got to work on this volume, how that journey started?
Mm. After I made that initial discovery, I realized, okay, there might be something here. There might be a bigger story, but it would involve tracking it down. I thought there
Mm-hmm.
may be an archive here or something like that, but it's going to involve my gathering it together. Um, I initially started with anthologies, looking for material that had already been collected from the prairies, and I found virtually nothing at that point. So I realized, okay, it's going to involve me doing primary research, going to archives, um, provincial archives, municipal archives, historical societies, and things like that, and to gather together whatever I could find written by someone who may or may not have been conscious of themselves as a Black person or as a writer. Um, so the project got really underway when I connected with some of the Prairie's main knowledge keepers. Um, the Prairie's own Black history has been kept alive informally more than textually and by word of mouth. So I connected, and also mostly this work of keeping knowledge has been done by women, by the matriarchs, Black matriarchs of the prairies. So when I connected with people like Junetta Jamerson is a community member in Alberta who comes from a family of historians. Her aunts, Velma Carter, Wanda Leffler Carter, Leah Carter, published 2 volumes of oral histories of what they call the Black pioneers to the prairies, people who came over mostly from Oklahoma, but also surrounding states to the Canadian prairies between 1910 and 1912. And so they collected 2 volumes of these oral histories, and it's just an absolute treasure trove of history. And I thought, wow, okay, there's really something here. Other knowledge keepers like Cheryl Fogo, a writer and historian, has done a lot of archival research herself in documenting early Black presences in southern Alberta. People who didn't write, but who nevertheless entered into the historical record. And I thought, oh wow, there's a whole history here. And that's what set me on my journey, realizing, okay, there's contemporary literature that I know about, but I can connect it now to archival material. And together that literature will span two centuries of time.
That's excellent. I'm wondering, just briefly, as you were, beginning your hunt for the writings and voices and content and stories, I'm curious what you thought about the lack of, or what seemed to be sort of a lack of organized archives, and what that might have told you about, this particular literary section of the regional kind of literature.
That's one of the main things I had to grapple with.
Yeah.
Because I encountered the Black presence of the prairies as an absence first. Even though I had grown up on the prairies, my family moved to Alberta in 1981 from Honduras. Growing up, I had no sense of the region having a substantial Black history. And as I delved into history books of the region, I also saw very little written documenting its Black history. So encountering this history and presence as an absence was my first sort of encounter. And I realized I had to invent the terms for the geography and even the experience. I had to invent the term Black Prairie to understand what it was that I was looking for. I'm not sure I answered your whole question. Could you remind me, I think, the second half of your question?
Yeah, just kind of what you mentioned you had sort of grappled with the idea that there seemed to be this lack of any kind of organized collection of what you were looking for, and I just was curious how that made you feel and what you thought about that.
Right. When I started looking for anything that I could find written by a Black person, I went to all the usual places that you would expect to find archival material. I went to archives, and that's where I found it, and that also was a revelation that it had been there all along. In all the usual places one would find archival material, but it was never recognized as an archive. It was never recognized as important, that it ought to be gathered together and seen as a kind of a body or a corpus. And so that's what I did.
You just heard from Karina Vernon, the editor of the Black Prairie Archives and an associate professor of English at the University of Toronto, where she focuses on teaching and research on Black Canadian literature, archives, and decolonization. This series is brought to you by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about what Karina discovered as she searched various archives for the works that are represented in her volume and how her book fits into the current cultural moment.
I don't know if it's this way in the US as well, but in Canada we're in an important moment of Indigenous cultural and political resurgence and sovereignty movements. So it was really important to me to attend to this as I was recovering the archive. I didn't want to think about the Black Prairies in a way that overwrote the primacy of Indigenous relationship to land. And I didn't want to reproduce the colonial understandings of that region. I wanted to think of Black stories, Black literature, and Black life in a way that also made space for Indigenous stories and histories, and to also see if I could look at the way that the stories are entangled.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media specialist, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.